We'll now see a very early game of Karpov's, where this game took place in Leningrad in 1966, where Karpov was at the time only 15 years old, but with very mature play, he was able to beat well-known Russian master Grigory Ravinsky with the black pieces, in a very smooth and actually very instructive game. Ravinsky was an older player at this time, a long time, one of the biggest personages in Soviet chess. And here we see him playing against the youngest of the next generation players. So Ravinsky began with e4, Karpov played e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, a6, bishop a4, knight f6, castles, bishop e7. Karpov, as he, especially in the first half of his career, he almost always chose to defend the Ruy Lopez and played classical systems, and he was a great expert in this. He also played with white in the first half of his career. And Ravinsky chose to play the slightly less well-known Queen e2, the whirl attack. On the surface, a very logical move. The queen defends the e4 pawn, and the rook, which typically the most common move is rook e1 here, but in this case the rook could go to d1 and support the advanced d4, or perhaps use the open d file in the future. And indeed, Queen e2 is an okay move, but it's not the main move for legitimate reasons. One of them is that the queen tends to be a little exposed, and sometimes the rook doesn't even belong on d1. But the move is definitely interesting and lesser explored area of chess. Karpov played b5, bishop b3, and now he chose d6. One of the differences between Queen e2 and Rook e1 is that the Marshall Gambit approach with castles and c3 d5 is more effective for black with a queen on e2. In fact, white normally doesn't accept the pawn and just plays d3, holding the center. Black has the more aggressive stance in the center then, but the pawns are also a little bit under pressure as well, and white can build up some pressure on the king side, bringing the knight to g3 or e3 and so on. Karpov chose not to play this way and just played d6, a very classical approach, protecting e5, letting the bishop out, and now the threat is knight a5, which couldn't have been played last move because the e-pawn would be hanging, but now the threat is to capture white's bishop, trade it off for the knight, which will give black a very good game. This is something which the player of the Ruy Lopez needs to know, that you don't want to allow this simple exchange of this bishop. In the long run, black will slowly open the game, and white will miss that bishop. So Ravinsky played c3, preparing d4 and creating a retreat for the bishop. Castles, rook to d1. This is the purpose of playing d4, of Queen e2, and supporting d4. Now came knight a5. So Karpov is actually just playing all the same moves as he probably would have played after rook e1 instead of Queen e2. He goes for the Chigorin setup with c5, and the knight eventually coming back to c6 behind the pawn, or potentially at least. Bishop c2, c5, d4, queen c7, h3. White prevents the pin bishop g4. It's also possible to play immediate d5 here, which is more common, but h3 is a reasonable move. And Karpov played rook e8. So he tries to point out one of the downsides of the queen's position on e2. Now there's rook is vis-a-vis the queen. Black prepares to open the e-file and start creating problems for white on the e-file. And this induces white to release the tension in the center. The way Ravinsky chose to do that was to take on e5. But this move looks to me that first is a very significant turning point in the game, because white, by this rather peaceful move. He basically declines to fight for an advantage. He creates, after d takes e5, a symmetrical center, with black having some play, extra space on the queen side, and having perfectly adequate development of his pieces. Releasing the tension here gives up any hope of a space advantage for white, releases this bishop. He's trading essentially the pawn on d4 for the pawn on d6. So he frees black's position considerably. If white's going to aim for an advantage, he needed to play d5, which is typically how people play these positions. And white can hope for an advantage in this kind of position. He has his space in the center. Black has some difficulty maneuvering. We see a similar position in Karpov's game against Ulf Andersson later in the course. But Ravinsky chose to take on e5. Black took back. Knight to d2. The knight needs to be developed, and so Ravinsky continues with the typical maneuver in the Spanish. The knight will go to f1, and from there to either e3 or g3. And now the very accurate move by Karpov, rook to d8. The rook has just moved to e8, and now he moves it to d8. But the timing is right, because now when the knight moves from d2, black will take on d1, and white will have to waste time recapturing either the queen or the bishop, neither of which belongs on d1 or will be staying there. Now knight f1, rook takes d1, queen takes d1, and c4. Another very typical move in this structure. Black gains further space and opens the c5 square for the use of his pieces, most likely the knight from a5, which will come via b7 to c5. Sometimes also bishop could be used on c5 as well. Bishop g5. So white wants to develop his knight maybe to e3, but he doesn't want to block in the bishop. So while black has a very fine game here, I think white is more or less keeping equality, because the one downside of black's position is the d5 square could be used for white, for a knight, for instance. So black has to watch that square. Meanwhile, otherwise the pawn structure is pretty symmetrical, so it's not easy for black to achieve anything with his space advantage. Bishop e6, queen e2, knight to b7, and now knight to g3. And I think this was a second significant error by Ravinsky. He probably wanted to, well, the knight just looks, this move looks more careful, more harmonious a little bit. The knight doesn't get in the way of the bishop as it would on e3. It aims for f5. It keeps the e4 square better, with better defense. But after g6, which Karpov played, the knight is restricted on g3 and has no purpose in being there. And eventually it spends a while on g3, unable to achieve anything, and has to be eventually moved elsewhere. Meanwhile, it's not possible to really exploit the weakness of black's king side. The g6 move was inevitable, and black's king is still perfectly safe. So it was better to play knight e3. And I think after knight e3, white is keeping equality. He can hope to use the d5 square. For instance, he can trade on f6 and bring the knight to d5, creating opposite colored bishop's position, and also, if black takes, opening up the bishop from c2. But after knight g3, g6, black's game is significantly more pleasant to play now. Rook to d1, rook to d8. Black challenges the d-file. Karpov is not afraid to exchange all the rooks, counting on his slightly better pieces to give him winning chances later on. His space advantage on the queen side. In particular, we'll start to see how this bishop, as the game goes on, starts to look worse and worse. The bishop on c2 is blocked by the pawn on e4. It's also restricted by black's pawn on the queen side. And if the dark squared bishops are exchanged, black ends up with the superior minor piece. Rook takes d8, bishop takes d8, queen e3. And here Karpov needed to be a little bit attentive, and he was. If knight to c5, very natural move. This is where the knight was aiming. Tries to put pressure on e4, maybe invade on d3. But here, white has knight takes e5. And after queen takes e5, bishop f4, and the black queen is suddenly trapped in the center. Black can actually save the queen with the move knight to d5, the only way to save the queen. But after, for instance, queen takes c5, the knight is pinned, black has to take on f4, e takes d5, and here things have changed drastically. White now has an extra pawn, a passed pawn, and the queen is very active, so it's better for white. So of course, Karpov did not allow that. Instead, he played knight to d7. He wants to exchange these dark squared bishops. Once he achieves this exchange, then white will be left with this bishop, which will not be really guarding the dark squares adequate. He won't quite have adequate defense of the dark squares. This bishop will be blocked by his center pawn. So the position of the center pawns is very important. This is what makes white's bishop the worst bishop, whereas the bishop on e6 works with black's central pawn structure. White could avoid the exchange of bishops by playing bishop h6, but after, for instance, f6, there could be new problems. First of all, the bishop is not really achieving anything there, and could even, if black knight comes to f7, could be in some trouble. But there's also the danger that this bishop, technically black's worst bishop, but could actually become even stronger with the bishop coming to b6. And this diagonal could be very tender for white, with threat on f2, threats on against f2, and so on. So Ravinsky acceded to the exchange. Bishop takes d8, hoping perhaps that on the, well, black's dark squares might, around the king side, might be a little drafty. He could get some counterplay later on. Knight takes d8. And now a third slight inaccuracy, queen h6. So notice that Ravinsky never really makes any huge mistakes in this game. He makes the slightly anemic exchange on e5, where he gives up his hope for an advantage, and then he makes a couple of tiny errors. But his game is very difficult to play, and it's hard for white to find a plan, which is ever since the exchange on e5, and this is what starts to lead him downhill. Queen h6 was another error because the queen doesn't achieve anything there. It's a rather impatient move, hoping to play knight g5, but of course Karpov is not going to allow that move, and played f6. And the queen found herself with no purpose on h6 and just retreated immediately to e3. So white lost a couple tempi. Wasn't really that important because there's not a lot he could do, but instead would have been better here to play queen to d2 immediately, and then if after, for instance, f6, he could start trying to maneuver his knight away from g3 where it's achieving nothing, and bring it to e3, and maybe he has some chance to invade on d5. White's a little bit worse here, but he is definitely fighting to hold the game. Queen h6, f6, queen e3, and Karpov played a5. So he just starts pushing the pawns immediately on the queen side. Before even bringing his knights in, I guess the knights it'll be a little bit more clear where the knights belong in a moment. Probably you could say, well, this one belongs on c5 and this one will come to d6, but he first creates some pressure against white's position and see how white's going to answer it. Ravinsky can try to get some counterplay with h4. Well, he weakens the black king at least a little bit with this advance of the pawn. b4, h5. So his hope is to exchange on g6 and then play queen h6 and perhaps knight h4, and there will be a lot of threats against g6. Black will not be able to carry out his play on the queen side comfortably, but this is easily dealt with. He just played king g7, stopping queen h6. And now it turned out that black was threatening b3, so white played bishop d1 to avoid the threat of b3. If white played some move like queen to d2, let's say, which looks natural, threatening to take on b4, taking over the d file, but here black could play b3. And the problem is that if white takes on b3, then c takes b3, and black will inevitably create a very strong passed pawn by pushing the a pawn, and this b pawn will become a passed pawn, and this will be decisive. Black's structural advantage on the queen side is too much. But if white doesn't want to take on b3, he would have to play bishop to b1, and now he's essentially down a bishop for the rest of the game. This bishop can't be activated. So it's blocked, but the only way it could get into the game is if somehow this e-pawn disappears. But black doesn't have to allow that to happen. For instance, now black could play knight f7 follow up by queen to d6 and offer an exchange of queens, which white really can't agree to, with him stuck essentially down a piece. And then later it would be possible to bring a knight a4, for instance, putting pressure on b2, or to play a4, forcing a3, and then sacrifice on a3. And basically white can't defend this position. His bishop is stuck on b1, it's vulnerable, and it's essentially down a piece because it can't get out. So that's why he played bishop to d1, anticipating the threat of b3. Now if b3, a3 is possible, and then the bishop can go to e2, and it's not stuck on b1. And white is holding then. So Karpov played knight f7, bringing the other knight in. h6, g6, h6, g6, knight to d2, knight to c5. And here Ravinsky made a rather desperate decision, b3, hoping to exchange the pawns on the queen side and achieve the draw. But of course this has the downside that it puts another pawn on a light square, and it leads to really a thematic positional advantage for black. If instead white didn't play b3, though, it was going to be very difficult to deal with black's pressure. So for instance, knight e2, then queen to d6, for instance, and the queen is coming into d3. If white tries to get counterplay with f4, black can immediately go queen to d3, and black is just winning. The queens can't be traded because the pawn will capture back and attack the knight on e2, and pawn on f4 then will be captured. Well, if white takes on c5, then queen takes d2, and this bishop is just stuck, and it can't move away because the knight will be taken. There's no way to defend the bishop, and the black king is perfectly safe. So it's not easy to give white any advice here. So that's why he played b3, hoping to get some sort of freedom. Black took on b3, and now white had to take back with the pawn. If he captured with a piece on b3, black would take with his knight and then take on c3 because the queen would be guarding. That pawn, passed pawn would be decisive. Meanwhile, if c takes b4, then black could throw in b takes a2, threatening to make a second queen. So white had to take back with his pawn. And now came queen to b6. So here, if white takes on b4, then the queen can capture back, and this pawn on b3 will not be defensible, especially because black is bringing up another knight with knight to d6, knight to b5, and knight to d4. The pressure on white's position is just too much. Compare this bishop to black's knight. Black's knight, or we can compare the bishop on d1 to the black bishop on e6. The knights are also more active, and we really feel the weakness of white's dark squares. So white played knight g to f1. Now came knight to d6. And here white made a major concession. He played c4, but it was hard to give advice. If he played, for instance, bishop c2, then black's plan was to take on c3 and bring the knight to b5 and then to d4. And this is too much positional pressure. White can't hold such a position. The b3 pawn will soon be lost, and black's a pawn will be too strong, and supported by very active pieces as well. So white played c4, which blocks the bishop out and keeps black from getting a knight to d4, at least immediately. But now it allows black to create a winning passed pawn on the queen side. So Karpov did that first. He played queen c6, attacking the e-pawn, and after bishop c2, a4. B takes a4, bishop takes c4, and so it's still equal material, but this pawn is supported by all of black's pieces. White's pieces are still very passive. White's position still has weaknesses everywhere. So it was a desperate situation for White, and his only hope was to try to get some kind of counterplay on the king side, to try to expose the black king and aim for a perpetual check of some sort. He began with knight to g3. If he took on c4, of course, knight takes c4 and queen e2, then black can play knight to b3 knight to a3, for instance, followed by b3 and so on. And black's strong knights will shepherd the b pawn home. Knight to g3. Black played bishop f7. a5. Well, black would take this pawn if given the opportunity. So white plays a5. Black plays queen b5. He's still going to capture the pawn, but at least takes a couple tempi to do so. And Ravinsky tries his last hope with f4, trying to open up the king side and the black king a little bit and create some sort of threats. But Karpov was ready for this. He took on a5, and after f takes e5, important detail was queen a1 check, and the queen captures on e5. Of course, if pawn takes e5, things would not be as clear. Would definitely not be as clear after, for instance, queen g5. When the pawn is under attack, and knight h5 or knight f5 are coming, knight f3, and suddenly the game changes. But Karpov had foreseen queen a1, king f2, queen takes e5. Further, well, black has, again, winning positional advantage. He's up a pawn. The b pawn can hardly be stopped, and white is still tied to his e pawn, and you can even still at this point see how this bishop is a bad bishop, inferior piece. But there was a final detail that Karpov had to have foreseen, knight f3. Attacking the queen and trying to drive it away from the knight on c5. If black had to play queen c3 in order to defend the knight, to keep the knight defended, then white could trade queens and play e5, for instance. And here it's rather unlikely that black will win. At least white has good chances to draw because of the lack of material. White removes a pair of pawns, and then the other knight will attack the c-pawn, for instance, knight e2. The white king can come over, and it looks likely that white will hold the draw. But Karpov had foreseen he could play queen to b2 here, keeping the queens on the board. The queen is necessary in order to break white's position down and to help to advance the b-pawn as well. And so, okay, the bishop is under attack, and black also prepares b3, so white had to take on c5. And now b3. The bishop is pinned. If white takes another knight with queen takes d6, then b takes c2, and black not only threatens to queen the pawn, he also threatens to queen it with check. So knight e2, c1, and the knight is pinned, and so black still ends up with two queens against one. So white played knight to d4, trying to guard on c2. Another move would be e5, another try to open things up. But here black can still play b takes c2. And after e takes f6, check king g8. And black again has no checks, and c1 is coming. So white played knight to d4. And however, after b takes c2, white resigns. Since if queen takes c2, the knight on d4 is hanging. If knight takes c2, and then knight c4 cuts the queen off from the knight and wins the pinned knight. Black is up a piece. Finally, if knight to e2, knight g to e2, trying to stop c1, then here that loses control over e4, and the knight fork wins the game.